Success doesn't shout. The world shows you images of noise, of big gestures, of stages and applause and winning at all costs. But the truth is, the people who build something that lasts move differently. They are not the loudest, not the flashiest, not the most followed. They are simply the most aligned. Because real success doesn't begin with achievement. It begins with behavior. And that behavior is shaped by habits. Not random habits, not hacks, but quiet, unseen, consistent practices that slowly shape a life of clarity, discipline, and peace. These are not the habits you'll find on posters. They are subtle, internal, silent, but they work. They endure. And the people who embody them don't always look successful at first glance, but over time they become undeniable. Let's begin with the first habit. Habit 1. They spend time alone on purpose. This seems simple, it is not. Because being alone is not the same as being lonely. The most successful people do not fear solitude. They seek it because they understand that in solitude, they are forced to listen to their thoughts, their patterns, their fears, their desires. They stop outsourcing their truth. They stop running from the silence. They sit in it until the noise settles, because only then can they distinguish what is theirs and what is conditioning. This is where decisions are made, not in chaos, but in clarity. They wake up early, not just to work, but to hear themselves think. They walk without music. They journal without filters. They build routines that protect their inner world before engaging with the outer one. They are not addicted to stimulation. They are devoted to stillness. And from that stillness, they develop a deep sense of direction. 1. That doesn't shift with trends or opinions. They don't make decisions based on likes. They make them based on alignment. And that alignment is recalibrated daily. In solitude, they don't fear being misunderstood because they understand themselves. They don't need external clarity because they've done internal inventory. This is not just quiet, it's design. A design for a life that doesn't react but responds. And that response is rooted in truth. You'll notice something about people like this. They're not rushing, even when they're busy. There's a slowness to their presence, because they've trained their nervous system not to live in survival. They've built mental clarity, the way others build social capital. Quietly, relentlessly, alone. That is the first silent habit. And without it, every other habit becomes noise. Because if you don't know what you actually want, if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, then you will chase a version of success that breaks you. And that is not success, that's performance. The most successful people do not perform. They prepare, they protect, they preserve what matters. And to know what matters, you have to get quiet enough to listen. Most people never do. Because silence reveals truth, and truth disrupts comfort. But successful people do not avoid discomfort. They train for it, and the first rep of that training happens in solitude before the world wakes up, before the inbox explodes, before the demands arrive. They return to the place where no one else can enter, their own mind, and they sharpen it daily. Not to outsmart others, but to outlast the distractions that keep most people in circles. You'll rarely see this, because it's not glamorous. It doesn't trend. It doesn't produce dopamine, but it works. Over time, that solitude becomes a sanctuary, a place to reset, to realign, to remember who they are. And they return to it religiously. because they know that in a noisy world, silence is strategy. And the people who can hold that silence are the ones who build something that cannot be shaken. They master the art of restraint, not suppression, not denial. Restraint, the ability to feel something deeply and still choose not to act on it. This is not about hiding. This is about honoring the moment, honoring the outcome, honoring the self that no longer moves out of impulse. Because success is not about power, it's about discipline. And the most successful people do not react, they respond. They don't raise their voice to prove a point, they don't speak. Just to fill silence, they don't act. Just because it's urgent. They move from principle, not pressure. And to do that, they train restraint like a muscle. They sit with discomfort without needing to discharge it. They feel anger and don't send the message. They feel doubt and don't abandon the vision. They feel fear and still move forward with a steady hand. This is what sets them apart. Because most people are driven by emotion. They make decisions from temporary states. They say yes because they're afraid of disappointing. They say no because they're afraid of failure. But successful people have built space between stimulus and response. And in that space they find power, not over others, over themselves. They don't suppress emotion, they study it. They ask, why am I feeling this? What story am I attaching to this feeling? What outcome will this lead to if I act on it? And then they decide, not react. Decide. Because reacting is what people do when they've given their power away. Deciding is what people do when they've built it from within. This habit doesn't get attention because no one sees the message you didn't send, the argument you didn't escalate, the deal you didn't chase out of desperation. But over time it shapes everything, because restraint preserves energy, preserves relationships, preserves integrity. And those three are the foundation of real success. Without them you burn out, you break trust, you betray yourself. But with them you move different. You pause before entering a room. You breathe before replying to criticism. You wait until the emotion passes before making the call. And from the outside, it may look like you're slow, passive, detached. But inside, you are choosing what version of you will handle this. And the version you choose is not the wounded one, not the impulsive one, not the ego. You choose the leader, the one who doesn't flinch when provoked, the one who doesn't chase just to feel validated, the one who doesn't collapse at discomfort, because that leader is who you've trained to become through daily deliberate restraint. You'll notice something about successful people. They don't react to praise any more than they react to hate, because they've learned that both are noise, and their path is too important to be swayed by noise. So they stay centered. They let others rush. They let others shout. They let others demand. But they remain unmoved. Not because they don't feel, but because they've chosen not to follow every feeling. Because not every feeling deserves your attention. Not every thought deserves your energy. Not every urge deserves your action. And the ones who understand this are the ones who stay consistent long after the excited ones burn out. Because emotion is temporary, but decisions are permanent. And if you make permanent decisions from temporary states, you will destroy what you were meant to build. The most successful people have learned this. Often the hard way. But they took the lesson and turned it into a habit. A quiet, invisible habit called restraint. They protect their energy like it's sacred, because to them it is. They don't treat time as their most valuable resource. They treat energy as the currency that builds everything, Because without energy, time means nothing. You can have an open calendar and still be too drained to move forward. So successful people don't waste energy on noise. They don't chase closure. They don't argue with fools. They don't explain their standards to people committed to misunderstanding them. Because they know every moment spent on something that leaks energy takes away from what they're building. This is why they move differently. They don't overbook. They don't overpromise. They don't overextend. Because over anything is the beginning of burnout. Instead, they observe. Who gives energy? Who takes it? What environments expand them? What habits deplete them? And from that observation, they make quiet, radical decisions. They walk away without announcements. They say no without explanation. They choose solitude over shallow company, not because they're antisocial, but because they've learned that people-pleasing is the fastest way to emotional poverty. They no longer make themselves available to every opportunity that shows up. Because they know that not all access is aligned, and success isn't about how many people know your name. It's about how much of your energy remains yours at the end of the day. This is why they value rest, not as a reward, but as a requirement. They don't glorify the hustle that leads to collapse. They optimize for sustainability. They wake early, not to grind, but to ground. They take breaks not out of guilt, but out of design. They rest not to recover from doing too much, but to maintain doing what matters. This is misunderstood because the world tells you that saying yes means you're strong, that being busy means you're important, that being exhausted means you're succeeding. But successful people see through that. They don't romanticize burnout. They don't chase validation through sacrifice. They honor their system. They protect their rhythm. They prioritize boundaries, and those boundaries are not just external. They also protect internal energy. They limit overthinking, rumination, mental clutter, because they know that mental fatigue is invisible but dangerous. So they practice mental hygiene. They leave conversations that go in circles. They pause before reacting. They journal to download their thoughts before they spiral. They meditate, not for enlightenment, but for recalibration. They walk without a destination, just to come back to themselves. They unplug not to escape, but to return. This is why they last longer, not because they do more, but because they protect what fuels it all, their energy. This is the habit that holds the rest. Because without energy, discipline breaks. Clarity blurs. Creativity fades, and success turns into survival. But they refuse to survive. They build from fullness, and that fullness comes not from doing more, but from holding less. Less noise, less drama, less pressure to be everywhere and everything. They focus, and focus is expensive. It requires saying no to what looks good, so you have energy for what's great. And that is the silent habit that separates movement from momentum. They protect their energy like it's sacred, because to them it is. They don't treat time as their most valuable resource. They treat energy as the currency that builds everything. Because without energy, time means nothing. You can have an open calendar and still be too drained to move forward. So successful people don't waste energy on noise. They don't chase closure. They don't argue with fools. They don't explain their standards to people committed to misunderstanding them. Because they know every moment spent on something that leaks energy takes away from what they're building. This is why they move differently. They don't overbook. They don't overpromise. They don't overextend. Because over anything is the beginning of burnout. Instead, they observe who gives energy, who takes it, what environments expand them, what habits deplete them, and from that observation, they make quiet, radical decisions. They walk away without announcements. They say no without explanation. They choose solitude over shallow company, not because they're antisocial, but because they've learned that people-pleasing is the fastest way to emotional poverty. They no longer make themselves available to every opportunity that shows up, because they know that not all access is aligned. And success isn't about how many people know your name. It's about how much of your energy remains yours at the end of the day. This is why they value rest, not as a reward, but as a requirement. They don't glorify the hustle that leads to collapse. They optimize for sustainability. They wake early, not to grind, but to ground. They take breaks, not out of guilt, but out of design. They rest, not to recover from doing too much, but to maintain doing what matters. This is misunderstood, because the world tells you that saying yes means you're strong, that being busy means you're important, that being exhausted means you're succeeding. But successful people see through that. They don't romanticize burnout. They don't chase validation through sacrifice. They honor their system. They protect their rhythm. They prioritize boundaries. And those boundaries are not just external. They also protect internal energy. They limit overthinking, rumination, mental clutter, because they know that mental fatigue is invisible but dangerous. So they practice mental hygiene. They leave conversations that go in circles. They pause before reacting. They journal to download their thoughts before they spiral. They meditate, not for enlightenment, but for recalibration. They walk without a destination, just to come back to themselves. They unplug not to escape, but to return. This is why they last longer. Not because they do more, but because they protect what fuels it all, their energy. This is the habit that holds the rest. Because without energy, discipline breaks, clarity blurs, creativity fades, and success turns into survival. But they refuse to survive. They build from fullness. And that fullness comes not from doing more, but from holding less. Less noise, less drama, less pressure to be everywhere and everything. They focus. And focus is expensive. It requires saying no to what looks good. So you have energy for what's great. And that is the silent habit that separates movement from momentum. They reflect more than they react. This is the quiet power that changes everything, because the average person spends more time explaining, defending, responding than they do pausing, observing, understanding. But successful people reverse the equation. They don't live in constant reaction. They live in reflection. They pause before they post. They process before they reply. They consider before they commit. Not because they are slow, but because they are strategic. They understand that speed without direction is just noise. That clarity requires distance. That wisdom requires reflection. So, they build time into their day to think, to sit without input, to notice their own thoughts, to ask, why am I feeling this way? What is this moment asking of me? Where is this leading if I don't intervene? This kind of questioning doesn't look productive, but it's how they stay aligned. Because they don't just want results, they want the right results. And the right results come from the right decisions. And the right decisions come from inner stillness, so they prioritize that stillness. Not once a week, not when convenient, daily. They build it like a discipline. They keep a journal, not for the aesthetic, but for the analysis. They reflect on conversations to catch patterns. They revisit choices to identify what worked and what didn't. They track, Not just metrics, but behavior. How did I show up? Was I honest? Was I reactive? Was I present? This level of honesty is rare because it forces you to confront yourself, to see where you fell short, where you made excuses, where you defaulted to old habits. But that confrontation is what creates evolution, because without reflection you repeat. Without reflection you carry the same problems into new situations and wonder why nothing changes. But successful people don't just move on, they move forward. And moving forward requires integration. You can't integrate what you don't acknowledge. So they stop, they sit, they face it, not to dwell, to understand. Because understanding is what transforms pain into precision. They don't avoid the hard questions, they welcome them. Because they know that unchecked emotion becomes sabotage, that unreviewed action becomes noise, that unexamined growth becomes shallow, and shallow success cannot hold pressure. So they go deep, quietly, privately, routinely, and because of that they become unshakable. Not because they never fail, but because they know why. And when you know why, you don't repeat. You rebuild, you rewire, you refine. And refinement is where mastery lives. This is the difference. Most people want breakthroughs. Successful people want patterns. Because patterns tell the truth and truth guides action, so they reflect on wins, on losses, on conversations, on instincts. Not out of obsession, out of discipline. Because discipline is not just doing more, it's knowing what not to repeat. And that knowing comes from silence, from space, from truth. So they build it into their system, not as a luxury, as a non-negotiable, because without it, they are just reacting to everything. But with it, they are choosing everything. And that is how they move with purpose. They move in silence until it's time to speak through results. This habit is deeply misunderstood in a world obsessed with sharing. We've been taught that progress must be visible, that work must be announced, that movement must be broadcasted for it to count. But the most successful people don't move that way. They build without fanfare. They grow without explaining. They shift without needing permission because they've learned that silence protects momentum. That energy leaks through unnecessary exposure. And so they go quiet on purpose. They don't talk about their plans until those plans are no longer up for discussion. They don't explain their pivots until the new foundation is already laid. They don't invite input into stages of creation that require solitude, not opinions. This is not secrecy. This is sacred space. Because they've lived through what happens when you share too soon, when you let energy escape into conversations that aren't built to hold your vision. When you invite commentary from minds who haven't done the work to understand your direction, they've seen how quickly momentum dies when validation becomes the goal. So now they hold it, the idea, the shift, the decision. They sit with it long enough to know it's real, long enough to refine it without external interference, long enough to hear their own voice before letting the world speak. And when they do speak, it's not to convince. It's to confirm what has already been lived. This is rare because it requires security in silence, confidence without confirmation, presence without performance. But they've learned that what grows in quiet grows with roots, and rooted success can't be shaken by noise. This doesn't mean they're hidden, it means they're focused. They're not antisocial, they're anti-fragmentation. They don't need to prove they're working, they need to protect what they're building. Because energy is currency, and once it's spent on endless updates and overexposure, it's hard to recover. So they preserve it. They don't show you, Every step. They show you mastery. They don't walk you through the process. They walk out with precision. And that precision came from silence, from doing the work alone, from questioning without noise, from building without distraction. You'll notice they don't rush to be understood, because they know that early explanations come from insecurity. But when you're certain, you don't explain. You demonstrate, and they've chosen demonstration. Their success is not a surprise, it's just the part you finally got to see. But the real work, the most important work, already happened in early mornings, in late nights, in quiet decisions, in unshared sacrifices. That's where the power is. Not in the post, not in the pitch, not in the press. In the pause before they moved, in the silence where they built clarity, in the stillness where they chose alignment over attention. This is what gives their voice weight when they finally speak. Because it's not just talk, it's truth. Backed by silence, tested by solitude, delivered through action. And when they show up, it's not for applause, it's to honor what they've already become. They detach from outcomes, but stay obsessed with process. This is one of the hardest habits to build, because the world trains us to measure everything by the result, the number, the title, the position, the applause. But the most successful people have flipped that logic. They don't tie their identity to what they achieve. They tie it to how they show up, to the work, to the discipline, to the consistency. No one sees. They know that chasing the outcome creates pressure, and pressure clouds precision. So they stop chasing, not because they don't care, but because they care too much to be distracted by short-term results. They fall in love with the process, with the training, with the refinement, with the boring, daily unseen work that turns average into mastery, and they do it without guarantee. They show up without needing applause. They repeat without seeing progress. They persist even when no one notices. Because for them, this is not a show. This is a standard. They are not performing. They are practicing. And practice is not glamorous. It is repetition without reward, effort without evidence, discipline without drama. But that is where greatness grows. In the gym before sunrise, at the desk after everyone logs off, in the journal that no one will ever read. And while others quit when results are slow, they keep going because they never expected immediate validation. They expected to be tested. And the test is not about talent. It's about tension. Can you hold the tension of doing the right thing without reward? Can you continue without applause? Can you keep building when it feels like nothing's changing? They can. Because they've trained detachment. They've trained their nervous system not to panic when the outside world is quiet, because inside they are loud, loud with conviction, loud with clarity, loud with the echo of their own integrity. This is freedom, to show up without being pushed, to persist without pressure, to rise without recognition, because the result will come. But it won't matter if you're empty when it does. So they stay full of presence, full of purpose, full of principles. And those principles tell them that process is where power lives. This doesn't mean they don't set goals. It means they don't collapse when goals take longer than expected. They adjust, they adapt, but they don't abandon. They keep showing up to the same basic work with elite focus, and that's why they become exceptional. Not because they had a better plan, but because they had a better posture. One that said, I'm not here to chase outcomes. I'm here to build myself until outcomes chase me. And eventually they do. Not by accident, by alignment. Because when you detach from outcome, You stop making decisions from fear. You stop rushing. You stop forcing. You start listening. And that listening leads you to the exact thing you would have missed had you been focused only on the finish line. This is the quiet habit that separates longevity from luck. They end the day with internal honesty. This habit may be the quietest, but it's the one that holds them accountable when no one else can. At the end of each day, they don't look for how much they accomplished. They look for how deeply they aligned. Because success is not just about action, it's about accuracy. And accuracy requires honesty. So they ask themselves, in silence, with no audience, with no metrics, with no filters, was I real today? Did I live by my code? Did I act from courage or convenience? Did I speak truth? Or did I perform peace? Did I stay present or did I drift into distraction? They don't ask to judge. They ask to refine. They understand that mastery is not a destination. It is a conversation, one they have with themselves, daily. And in that conversation, there is no ego, no excuse, no pretending, just clarity, just correction, just quiet recommitment. They don't wait for the big failure to start reflecting. They reflect when things go right, to make sure they don't go wrong later. They notice the slight tension in the meeting that no one else caught. They acknowledge the shortcut they almost took but didn't. They feel the gratitude they didn't express and decide to do better tomorrow. This is not a ritual. It's a responsibility, because no one sees your integrity like you do. And if you don't check it, it fades. Not in one big decision, but in 1,000 small ones. A conversation you should have had, a distraction you justified, a promise you didn't keep even if no one knew, but you knew. And that knowing shapes your identity. So they protect it. They end the day, not with noise but with alignment. Sometimes in a journal, sometimes in a breath, sometimes in a few quiet words before sleep, but always they return to self. And in that return, they reset. They don't carry the weight of the day into tomorrow. They extract the lesson and leave the rest. Because tomorrow requires fresh clarity, and they won't have it if today's confusion follows them to bed. This habit seems small, but it is the difference between momentum and misalignment, because days become weeks. Weeks become months. And what you fail to notice, you continue to normalize, so they notice. They catch it when they're off. They catch it when they're slipping. They catch it when their tone didn't match their truth, and they course correct before it becomes a pattern. This is the final habit, the habit that holds all others. Because if you don't reflect, you forget. If you don't ask, you assume. If you don't return, you drift. But they don't drift. Because every night they ask, was I who I said I would be? And if the answer is no, they don't spiral. They simply begin again tomorrow. There's a moment when you realize that success is not just about what you pursue. It's about what you're willing to release. And this release doesn't happen in public. It doesn't trend. It doesn't come with applause. It happens silently, in your own chest, in your own journal, in the decision. You don't announce but follow through with conviction, because the deeper you go into your own evolution, the more you begin to outgrow things you once prayed for. Opportunities you thought you couldn't live without. Relationships you thought you had to keep. Identities you believed defined you. And then one day, without warning, they begin to feel heavy. Not wrong, just outdated. And if you're honest, you feel it. In the body first, a tightness, a resistance, A fatigue that has nothing to do with effort and everything to do with misalignment. That's the signal. And successful people don't ignore it. They listen, they lean in, they begin to detach from what no longer supports their integrity. This is the ninth habit. The habit of letting go without performance. They don't make it theatrical. They don't need closure from the outside, because they've learned that most closure comes from self-trust. The trust that says, I don't need to stay to prove I'm loyal. I don't need to explain to validate my growth. I don't need to keep carrying what I've already outlived. So they release. They release jobs that no longer align, even if they're comfortable. They release connections that drain, even if they've lasted for years. They release routines that made sense in another season but now keep them stuck. They release guilt that's not theirs. Expectations that never came from their own values. Roles they were assigned but never agreed to. And they do it without burning down the room. Because this isn't rebellion. It's refinement. Letting go is not about being ruthless. It's about being real. Real enough to say I can't carry this anymore. Not because it's bad, but because it's no longer mine. And that honesty requires maturity. Because most people cling out of fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of being wrong. Fear of not having a backup plan. But successful people have made peace with the unknown. They know that life expands in direct proportion to your willingness to release. So they do it often, not recklessly, not emotionally, but clearly. They recognize when it's time. Time to pivot, time to pause, time to make space for the next version to emerge. Because if they don't, that version will never arrive. There's no room for it. So they clear the room. Silently, carefully, with respect for what once was and reverence for what's to come. This is why their path looks clean, not because it was easy, but because they decluttered relentlessly. They removed what wasn't aligned. They stopped negotiating with people who wanted the old version back. They stopped explaining why the old dream no longer fits. They stopped pretending that growth can coexist with constant compromise, and they started choosing themselves again, and again, and again. Until choosing themselves was no longer painful, it was peaceful, and now that peace is their compass. If it costs peace, it's too expensive. So they pay with presence. They invest with truth and they let go with grace. You won't recognize them at first, because real success doesn't look like success. In its early stages, it looks quiet. It looks focused. It looks like discipline that no one claps for. It looks like walking away from rooms that many people spend their whole lives trying to enter. It looks like fewer words, fewer posts, fewer explanations, and more alignment, more solitude, more clarity. The people who are truly becoming something rare are not always visible, not because they're hiding, but because they've stopped needing to be seen. They're not chasing fame. They're not building identity through attention. They're building foundation through silence, through presence, through the repeated decision to stay consistent when no one is watching. They don't need feedback to stay focused. They don't need validation to keep showing up. They don't need applause to feel enough, because they've learned that anything built on external energy will collapse when that energy disappears. So they've gone deeper. They don't just show up to win. They show up to live a certain way, a way that aligns with their values, with their code, with their own personal standard of what it means to be excellent. And that standard doesn't fluctuate, not when things go well, not when things fall apart, because it's not reactive, it's chosen. They've chosen to live a life that cannot be moved by trends or applause or pressure. They've chosen to build from within. And that inner structure is why they don't break. Because they didn't rush the process. They didn't skip the hard parts. They didn't fake it for followers. They slowed down. They simplified. They stopped trading their peace for progress. And in doing so, they became stable. You'll notice it in how they speak. There's no urgency, no desperation, no attempt to impress. Just clarity, just truth, just quiet confidence. That only comes from being tested and choosing to stay with the work anyway. They've let go of what no longer fits. The old goals, the old metrics, the old ways of measuring worth. They don't need to be everything. They don't need to be everywhere. They just need to be where they said they'd be, doing what they said they'd do. And that is power, because most people are constantly negotiating with themselves, back and forth. Should I stay? Should I change? What will they think? But the most successful people have removed the noise. They don't ask for reassurance. They build from responsibility. Because success is not an identity you adopt, it's a practice you embody. It's not about how loud you are, it's about how deeply you live, how consistently you return to your own principles, even when it's inconvenient, even when no one's watching, even when everything could be justified otherwise. Because character is not about doing what's right when it's easy. It's about doing what's right when it would be so easy to look the other way. And they don't look away. They look in every single day. They audit, they adjust, they recommit. Not because they have to, but because they can't imagine living any other way. You see, the goal was never to be impressive. It was to be aligned, to be free. Not the kind of freedom that comes from having options, but the kind of freedom that comes from needing less. From being internally full without external filling. From walking through life not asking how do I win, but instead asking, how do I remain true? Because in a world that sells success through image, through speed, through noise, the rarest ones are the ones who became something you can't fake. Grounded, clear, whole, they don't crash. When the market changes, when the numbers drop, when the attention fades, because their worth was never built on any of those things. It was built on a code that no one can take from them. And that code is quiet, but firm. It tells them who to be when no one's watching, how to show up when no one's clapping, what to choose when everything's tempting, and how to walk away when staying would mean self-abandonment. This is the real success, not status, but stability. Not perfection, but peace. Not performance, but presence. And it's built in the silence that most people avoid. There is a phase few talk about, not because it's secret, but because it's silent. And in that silence you start becoming someone even you didn't expect. You no longer wake up chasing something. You wake up protecting something. Your energy, your integrity, your inner peace. It's subtle at first. You say no faster. You leave rooms sooner. You don't need to explain why something feels off, because you've trained to trust the feeling more than the feedback. This is the unspoken layer of success, the invisible architecture behind everything that lasts. Because what's public may impress, but what's private is what sustains. And successful people build in that private space more than anyone knows. They work not just on skills, but on state. They don't just study business. They study breath, stillness, triggers, resets. They don't just lead others. They lead themselves back to presence over and over and over again. Because even when the world is loud, they remain steady. That steadiness wasn't born from books. It was born in the moment. They chose to stay calm when they wanted to react, to stay focused when it would have been easier to escape. They learned that doing more is not the path. Doing the right thing, with the right energy, from the right place, is, and that place is always internal. You'll see them walking away from opportunities that pay more but cost too much. They don't buy their way in anymore. They build their way forward. They don't demand to be heard. They earn the right to be listened to by how consistently they embody their values, even in silence. And what's strange is that the further they go, the less they say, because they realize words aren't what change them. Experience did, discipline did, pain did, choosing better. When no one would have blamed them for choosing easier did, they no longer need to prove they're growing. Growth is now just the side effect of who they refuse to be again. They are no longer in transition. They are in transformation, not by force, but by design, not by volume, but by vision, and that vision is inward. They've learned to trust the direction that peace pulls them, to choose the slow route that builds stamina, to value presence over recognition. They don't fear missing out, because they've seen that being everywhere often means being nowhere fully. So they simplify their calendar, their circle, their consumption, their self-talk. They've decluttered not just their homes but their minds, because space is clarity, and clarity is power. Not aggressive power, but stable power. The kind that doesn't shake when the room turns cold. The kind that doesn't chase when approval is withdrawn. The kind that doesn't bend just because pressure increases. They don't inflate, they anchor. And in that anchoring they become immovable. Not because life gets easier, but because they stopped negotiating with parts of themselves that used to sabotage progress. Now they sit with discomfort, longer than most. They pause before responding. They listen for the truth beneath the noise. And that truth has one message that returns again and again: protect your alignment more than your image. That is the 11th layer of silent mastery. They don't call it a system, or a philosophy, or a method, but you can see it in everything they do. There is a rhythm to how they breathe, a purpose to how they speak, a clarity in how they walk away from what no longer fits. This rhythm is not taught, it's earned through solitude, through surrender, through the thousands of moments they chose stillness over stimulus. Because the most successful people aren't always the ones who climb the fastest. They are the ones who paused longest to ask, am I climbing the right mountain? And when the answer was no, they had the courage to descend silently, to pivot, to start again, to rebuild without fanfare. That is power, not the kind that demands attention, the kind that sustains direction. Their life is not made of noise. It is made of non-negotiables. A morning that begins with intention, a boundary that doesn't bend, a standard that remains whether watched or not. These non-negotiables are not aggressive. They are quiet, but absolute, because they no longer shape their actions to be impressive. They shape their actions to be aligned, and that alignment is now the compass. It tells them what to pursue, what to release, what to revisit, and what to leave unfinished. Without guilt, they don't fear unfinished, they fear inauthentic. They don't cling to momentum if it costs clarity. They don't pursue growth if it dilutes peace, because their success is no longer measured by external metrics. It's measured by how deeply they can hear their own voice when the world gets loud, by how gracefully they can say no to things that once defined them, by how consistently they can return to what matters without needing to explain it. This is not about productivity. or performance, or perfection. It's about posture, how they hold themselves when things go wrong, how they don't flinch when delayed, how they sit in seasons of waiting without panic, because they trust the soil more than the speed. They know that roots grow silently before results appear, so they remain grounded, present, unshaken, not because they have no doubt, but because their discipline outweighs it. And now that discipline is not a struggle, it is who they are. They no longer have to force themselves to wake up early, to say no to distraction, to stay consistent when no one notices. It is no longer a habit. It is identity. They don't talk about these things. They don't need to. You can feel it when they speak, when they walk away, when they don't rush to defend their silence. Because silence has become sacred. It is not absence. It is alignment. And in that silence, they've built something that cannot be stolen. Not by failure, not by fame, not by the noise that used to pull them away from themselves. That is the final habit, to become unshakable. Not by appearing strong, but by returning, again and again, to what's true quietly.